There we go.
We're running.
Yes, okay, and I can edit that stuff. Excellent. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming today. I'm going to say just a couple of quick words of introduction. I've been saying fabulous things about Tom all week, so forgive me if I'm a little bit repetitive. And Tom will talk more about his background, but he's been a leader in the LGBT community for over 30 years. As I mentioned, in the survey research world, the phrase panel has a bit of a different meaning than it does in our world. In that world, it usually means people who've agreed to take surveys for money. And there are a lot of survey panels, and every single one of them says we're a community. And I think very few of them actually live up to the promise of that. And I think what Tom has built really does live up to that billing. As I mentioned also before, Tom is one of the most sought after consultants when it comes to marketing campaigns designed to connect with the LGBT community. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And that really dovetails with a lot of the marketing and communications work that we help our clients with. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Tom.
Thank you.
Awesome.
And thanks for sharing this time with me. I am not going to read a script. I speak a lot, different conferences and workshops and so forth. And if you want to interrupt me at any point, it's not going to disrupt the whole thing and throw me off. Happy to take questions as we go, or just keep remembering and we'll touch base again at the end. So yeah, the session today is Understanding and Marketing to LGBTQ Consumers. And part of that is understanding, of course, and marketing is another part of it. And what is LGBTQ? That's a big conversation that we're going to have today as well. So first of all, thank you to SimilarWeb for having this conversation. I started the company 25 years ago, and 25 years ago, very, very, very few people were having this conversation. More entities were afraid of LGBT and or gay back then, and what it meant then to embrace it or to even leverage their own employees and so forth. So we do conferences, and whenever I produce a conference, I always ask the speakers to say a little bit about themselves to kind of set the tone of, you know, who's this bozo up here pretending to be some kind of expert. So first of all, I'm a native. I grew up in Marin. That's my husband, Scott, and our dog, Leela, out at Point Reyes. Lived in San Francisco for 25 years until last July and moved back home. I'm in Corte Madera now and loving the bike trails and running and everything else that I do there. And when I'm not giving talks and doing research, I try and do fun, crazy things. Like a couple of years ago, I mountain biked at the very top of the Himalayas, 18,380 feet. And that was awesome, and I recommend it. But I do all kinds of fun things like that. It just is kind of my passion. It's what makes me really enjoy what I do. And when I'm not doing all that, I teach transcendental meditation to people living with HIV through the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. And now we're doing a study with the Desert AIDS Project in Palm Springs. And really trying to get a sense of the physiological and psychological benefits of this practice on people living with HIV, and the results so far are phenomenal. So that's how I kind of give back. So as I mentioned, we've been around 25 years. We just celebrated our 25th anniversary, which in gay years is a lot. There aren't that many businesses owned and operated by the LGBT community that have been around that long. And some of our activities have been the range of research. So that research is kind of the two classic modes of quantitative and qualitative. And to do that, we leverage what is called our panel. Our panel are about 90,000 community representative LGBTQ individuals. And they're all over the world, but it's really focused on the US. And second market would be Canada, and third, China. And I'll touch on that in a couple minutes. But these LGBTQ consumers are derived from partnerships. We work with about 300 LGBT media, bloggers, influencers, organizations like Pride, film festivals, community centers, chambers of commerce. We send our link to our annual community survey out to them. They send it out to all of their readers, members, etc. And so we get a really nice representative sample of the LGBTQ community. And that is really important. I still today see articles written about a study on the LGBTQ market, and it's like 300 people, and they never disclose who they are, their gender identity, their age, and all of that really skews what kind of results you're representing. So our clients come to us because we have that kind of very broad perspective and the ability, for example, if a client wants to understand pet ownership among lesbian couples in the Southeast, we can do that. So all these kinds of what would be hard to find and identify communities, we're able to do that. They know us and they trust us and they tell us all kinds of great information that we can trust. And over the years, we've been able to work with a wide variety of clients. This is literally just a small sample, but it gives you a sense of, tourism, finance, pharmaceutical, beverages, of course. We did a study last year for the U.S. Census. The census is really interested in understanding terminology when they're talking to the LGBTQ community about relationship status, transgender terminology, and so forth. So that was fascinating. We did focus groups and interviews in Portland, Oregon, Nashville, Tennessee, and Fargo, North Dakota, and interviewed LGBTs as well as straight people about these concepts, and it was an eye-opener. And often we work with other research companies who are having a difficult time filling a panel that would be representative across diversity. So enough about that. I want to talk a little bit about the LGBTQ community. I told Stephen that my only challenge here is not having enough time. I could talk for days probably, but I won't. And what I want to kind of do is give a high-level snapshot of a few different topics and get you thinking. And if there's time for some questions, that's great. If not, I'll give you my contact information. We can continue the conversation anytime. So, a lot of corporate America especially often, approach the LGBT community as a market. And I think that's fine because corporations have done far more for our community than the government has. And corporations have led in terms of employment opportunities, equal benefits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when they're interested in the LGBT market and we give them data on how they can be successful in our community, with that goes the responsibility and the obligation of getting involved in Out and Equal and supporting HRC and making sure that their employment policies are following best practices, doing that in-reach before they deserve to do the outreach. And it's been really, really very effective. So these numbers, the reason there's a range is because the census doesn't ask the question. So there's no figure of how many LGBTQs are in this country. It's a guesstimate. Everything else that we talk about is based on our research and fact, but everything having to do with the size of the community is always an estimate. And you'll find, and I'll talk about it a little bit, that different research reports come up with different numbers and different percentages, and a lot of that comes down to how they're asked. What is the question and what those results are. So we just finished our 12th annual LGBT community survey. In that survey, we had about 40,000 LGBTQ community members in 150 countries participate. What I'm going to be talking about is our USA report. The USA report is about 18,000, and we weight it so that it's equal gay and bi men, lesbian and bi women, and gender expansive transgender. So again, kind of high level, why is there such a thing as an LGBTQ market, and why are companies and organizations interested in the community? First of all, we're in the news. It's a topic of conversation. A lot of companies and organizations want to at least understand it. As far as a market goes, what company selling any product or service wouldn't want this double income, no kid marketplace? Whether gay or straight, that is typically higher income, more discretionary income, less having to save for weddings and school, et cetera, raising kids. But that's changing, and that's a really important point to note, and I'm going to talk on the LGBT family market that's kind of emerging. We're a cultural identity. There are quite a lot of LGBTQ people who are not attracted to someone of the same sex, and they just identify as queer, and that's something that's really growing in the youngest generation that's out there. I think that's fascinating. I'd say perception of greater income and wealth. It isn't necessarily the case. When we really dived into it, what we found was that LGBTs make as much as their neighbors, but we tend to live in really expensive places where we have to make a lot of extra money to afford it. So we make as much as everybody else in our zip code, for the most part. And ultimately that makes it look like, when we do a statistic on income, that LGBTs make more money. But we really...
live in expensive places because it's more accepting?
Yes, basically. So bluer cities that have a more educated community that is more accepting of diversity tend to be more expensive. And because they're highly attractive. I mean, there's only so much land here in San Francisco, so the more people that want to come here, of course, prices go up. There are great targeted outreach opportunities. You know, we have a very distinct infrastructure of media and communications. We're very brand loyal. When we first started doing our studies back in 1993, American Airlines was the first airline to emerge into the LGBT marketplace, and they're still the most loved because of that. They took a major step back in 1993. It was not anything like this right now. And they were very brave to not only get into the LGBT market explicitly, but stick with it even after these calls for boycotts, et cetera, from the right. Yeah.
What do they do specifically? They just like market packages for...
Yeah, so how did they emerge? So back then it was all about print advertising and pride sponsorship. That still exists today, but of course there are many, many other approaches that are also really successful. But yeah, they placed full page ads in the LGBT media, and that was huge. And not only was it huge for the consumer who's kind of like, wow, that's great, and now I want to fly American Airlines. It is great for those newspapers and those media, because to have that kind of income, I mean, obviously they only can exist if people buy ads. To have that kind of income. And also American Airlines really broke the ice. They made it possible for so many other companies, including their competitive airlines, to enter the market because, wow, American Airlines, based in Dallas, Texas, Fortune 50 company, marketing to the LGBT community, wanting to fill their planes with LGBT people, that was breakthrough. Yeah.
I'm curious if you do any analysis on if there's any like backlash towards that, like from people who are prejudiced, if there's anything that they'd be like, okay, I don't want to fly American Airlines.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes. There was. Okay. I don't think it's so much anymore. I actually gave a talk on this. What are the risks of reaching out to the community? And I put up these different slides, and you know, I put up a slide of Coca-Cola with their pride thing, and then Pepsi, and I said, you know, if you're going to boycott Pepsi and Coke, what are you going to drink? And then I put up, you know, Burger King and McDonald's and, you know, all these different fast food places, all of which had their LGBT outreach. And I said, if you're going to boycott all of them, what are you going to eat? And then I put up all the banks. Where are you going to bank? So at some point, all these companies hit a critical mass, and boycotts are just kind of fizzling. But yeah, it has happened. I just don't see it that much anymore. And we're said to be 3 to 6% of the population. We think that number is changing and growing based on our observations. So one thing that really brings us together as a community, because gay men and lesbians are very different, because men and women are very different. We shop differently, we're motivated differently, we consume media differently. So men and women are different, so therefore there can be no gay and lesbian market as such. So we extrapolate that to LGBTQ. We're very diverse across the entire spectrum of everything. But things that bring us together are those issues that are a challenge to us, because together we're a sexual minority, and some people really have a hard time with that. So you may not know, you may know, a bright group of people here, but in 29 states, you can be fired for being gay. 29 states, as of today, 29 states. Yeah, so it is kind of an eye-opener. We have a lot of challenges. Yeah, so here's a real thing that happens. An employee gets married to his husband on Saturday and gets fired from work on Monday, because all of a sudden it's all over Facebook. His employer says, oh, you're gay, you're out of here. And there's no protection. Yes. So that's why federally there's a movement, it's not going anywhere right now, but a movement to make a federal Non-Discrimination Act. So we face these. There's a lot of danger, especially to the transgender community now as well.
What about the Army?
Army is integrated. There still could be a lot of discrimination based on, whatever reason internally, but the Army, you can't be fired for being gay anymore.
Were those
That's
yellow-
very recent, though.
That's very recent, right?
Very recent, yeah.
For the yellow states, the ones that you can be fired in?
The yellow states, yeah, let me go back to that, sorry. Yeah. Yellow states are where you can be fired for being.
And then what's the little exclamation?
Well, there are some states with domestic partner benefits and
Okay.
some kinds of recognition.
Yeah.
Green is fully protected. You can see where those are. They're kind of similar to the blue states. And yellow are similar to the red states in a lot of ways too.
What about the light green?
The light green is only Wisconsin and New Hampshire, and I don't have my glasses on. So you'll have to go back to
Okay.
that. I'll give you a copy of this. And then similarly, there are global challenges. So for example, in Bermuda, there was actually legislation to remove marriage equality from being legal in Bermuda. And so they did that. And so companies came together to fight that because, for example, Carnival Cruise Line has a lot of marriages on board, and they were having a lot of same-sex marriages, and a lot of ships are registered in Bermuda. So they came to the aid of the community there and said, we cannot have this happening. And Bermuda reversed it. The Supreme Court reversed it. So this is ongoing. I mean, the story of 2 years ago and the story of 5 years ago and 10 years ago, we're always fighting something because we're a discriminated against segment of society. Important to what makes us tick as a market is how a company treats their own employees. So we always create and present this checklist about sensitivity training in the office, embracing your LGBTQ employees. A lot of companies have what's called an ERG, an employee resource group of the LGBT community, similar to what they might have for women and African American, et cetera. We encourage them to advertise in the LGBTQ media, even though more and more of us are consuming mainstream press just as much. Supporting the local media is a big deal. So this is kind of the checklist that we put out. One of the things is including LGBT imagery in general market advertising. Maybe you've seen some of those commercials where Coca-Cola or General Motors or Amazon include a little vignette with LGBT people, and that's just fantastic. So we encourage that. So that's kind of a checklist. So there are lots of things that separate us out from the general market in terms of the challenges that we face. But one thing that we've asked in one of our surveys is, how do you describe yourself? And honestly, everybody describes themselves just like everybody else. So in a lot of ways, we are just like everybody else, and we don't want to be a separate segment or market. We just want to be included and not discriminated against. And when we asked parents to write what 3 words do you feel as being an LGBTQ parent, normal was one of them, one of the most important ones to them, because they felt like they really had to express the fact that they are just like everybody else. They're raising kids and they have those challenges, and it's all about being a parent. So I think a big message when you're looking at the LGBTQ community is that we represent a slice of the population. Every community, every culture, every interest, every religion has a percentage of LGBTQ people in it. It's just, we're born that way, and it's going to happen. How that child is raised and what struggles that child faces as they grow up is where the differences are. But there are LGBTQ people across the strata of the community. So one thing that I've sort of observed over the years is that back in the 90s or early 2000s, a lot of the clients that would come to me were kind of the designated LGBT person in a company. Like American Airlines, they had their gay employee network, and they were the ones who went out to do all the community events and that kind of thing. But more recently, it's the diversity and inclusion director or vice president of a company. And I think that's a big change, because diversity and inclusion always has been looking at okay, let's be sure that our advertising includes people of color and older people, et cetera, and now they're being charged with saying, well, LGBT is part of that discussion. So now they're seeing diversity is including LGBT, but at the same time, diversity is part of LGBT. And what we're finding also is that there's kind of an intersectionality, you know that term, where there's kind of a cross-indexing. I may be gay, but I'm also Jewish, and I'm also a vegetarian, okay? And I also love mountain biking. So there are lots of different interests and communities that we belong to. In fact, we just did a study, and I don't have time to get into it now, but a study that asked various segments of the LGBT community. For example, the Asian American community, we said, do you identify more with the LGBT community or with the Asian American community? And it was really interesting to see the different segments that we talked to identifying in different ways with their ethnic or racial community versus their sexuality or orientation. Yeah.
I have a quick question about that. I know you want to run too deep into it. I listen to a podcast that often talks about the struggles of like how to prioritize those things and what they feel like they have to deal with first.
Yeah.
As far as like, do I reckon like podcasts people like two young black kids who live in New York,
Right.
and they're like, I always struggle with the being where I prioritize myself as a black female or black male before I prioritize myself as a black lesbian female.
Right.
Or black.
Or female, for that matter. Right, yeah. So obviously different people are going to have different life experiences that will answer that question for them. There's no trend, but it is interesting, and I'll give you the link to download the full report. You can see community by community how that differs. It's fascinating. So that's the diversity story, and sort of along that line, how would you think that a lesbian couple in their 60s who are retired living in a retirement community would be at all the same market as a 22-year-old queer guy is getting his first job in Manhattan? They are different animals, right? They're different media consumption, different life experience, different interests, different communities. Everything about them is different except that they're both LGBTQ. So that goes across the board, and that's why we really emphasize the diversity within LGBT. We are not one singular market. All right, so moving on, I'm going to give you a kind of an example of that. We do a tourism survey every year, and this asks over the past few years, what kind of traveler do you think you are? And, you know, just as you'd expect, rest and relaxation is really important, and you know, museums and culture and historical attractions are kind of appealing to all LGBTs, so that's one thing that we have in common. Where you start to see differences is that the lesbian community is much more, has much more of an affinity with natural scenery and outdoor activities and adventure. So if we have a destination client, we emphasize, if you want to reach the lesbian community, emphasize your parks, your outdoor activities, things that you can, and that lesbians can enjoy with their partner or their friends out of doors. The opposite of that is gay men, typically like big city energy. They like LGBT popular destinations and nightlife. So that makes gay men, in this case, different kinds of travelers than lesbians. But it also is important to kind of point out that it also makes gay men different than straight men and lesbians different than straight women, because typically you would, again, stereotypically, you would think typically that the guys would want to, you know, throw on their hiking boots and get outdoors and go fishing and do outdoor kind of stuff, and that stereotypically women might be more interested in shopping and spas and kind of the finer experiences of a city. That's opposite of how we tick. So there are assumptions you can make that kind of appeal to all of us, and then when you start to dive in, you see where some differences can be found. And also in terms of relationship status, it may be no surprise that lesbian women are far more likely to be in a same-sex relationship than an opposite-sex relationship, although a few are, and same with gay men. But when we start to look at the B in the LGBT, we start to see some really interesting things happen. And that 47% of the lesbian bisexual women are in a same-sex relationship, bisexual women are in a same-sex relationship, and about 40% are in an opposite-sex relationship. And among bisexual men, 33% in same-sex and 60% in opposite sex. So that makes our assumption that you can reach and understand bisexual men the same way as gay men, No, you can't, because they're involved in the general market, you know, in a much bigger way. And gender expansive, we also ask, are you in a relationship with someone who identifies other than male or female? And 26% of transgender and gender expansive people are in a relationship with someone who isn't binary in that way. So all these stats are opening up more and more questions, which as a researcher I find fascinating. So let's talk a little bit about kids, because I want to get into some of the case studies before we start running thin on time. So right now, if a client is interested in the LGBTQ market, but a family slice of that, we really point them to Generation X lesbians. They're far more likely to have kids living at home than others. But we're also finding that boomer women are also have kids, and they have kids who are over 18, probably from a previous heterosexual relationship, and they're starting to have grandchildren. We did a study for Disney that was all about grandchildren because, of course, you know, multi-generational marketing is really important to a lot of tourism and hospitality. People are, you know, grandparents are taking their grandkids on their first trip to Disney, et cetera, et cetera. So they really wanted to understand that, and that was the first time that we saw a company that was interested in the grandkids market. So there's lots of different approaches, and kind of what we come up with is there's something for everyone in LGBTQ. So this is an eye-opener as well. In the past, we have seen far more lesbians having kids, but now, and you see in the future, 48% of lesbian and bisexual females are interested in having kids in the future. But look at that number above. Gay and bisexual men, almost 50%. So things are going to change big time, whereas right now it's all about lesbians with kids. It's going to be very equalized in the next generation because more and more gay men are having kids and growing families as well. So I want to touch on terminology because I think it's super important. Communications are all about terminology. You know, if I say the wrong thing to a group, it could erase all of my marketing. And we see that happen sometimes when people use the wrong terminology, like at a gala that's a fundraiser for an LGBT charity. They may say the wrong word, and I'm going to touch on some of those wrong words. But right now, among the various generations, millennials, Gen X, and boomers, we see that LGBTQ has for the first time risen to be the most accepted terminology. And now this terminology, the way we ask it is when a corporation addresses you, what kind of term do you want them to use? Okay, so queer is pretty far down there, but if it's a queer film festival and it's kind of the community talking to the community, that's a different story. We're totally good with that, but we don't want American Airlines or Hyatt calling us queer, right? So that's just kind of a generational thing too. LGBT plus is a term that we're starting to see grow. We only saw it for the first time last year. It's kind of like fatigue of the alphabet, where LGBT is good. Let's sort of summarize everybody else with a plus. Queer, you can see as the generations go, millennials are much more down with the term queer. Boomers are not so much because it was very derogatory when boomers were young and being called queer. LGBTQI, the I is intersex, and if you're ever marketing in Europe or in South America, I is used all the time. It's always either LGBTI or LGBTQI. It's just kind of a cultural thing. And GLBT has really gone away. Back in the 90s, everything was GLBT. Now it's all LGBT or LGBTQ. So it changes every year, and we ask this question every year, and every year it changes. Same gender loving is a term more used among the African American community. Is there a question? Okay. So, and similarly across the gender, the cool thing about our large studies is we get huge numbers of people, and we can do these matrix breakouts. And LGBTQ is also strong among all the genders, lesbian and bi women, gay and bi men, and gender expansive. Gay and lesbian community, well, we caution that because that explicitly excludes the trans and gender expansive communities. So we really don't want to see gay and lesbian community, even though years ago it was fine. And queer, gender expansive does like that more, and lesbians are more okay with it. but gay and bisexual men not. So it kind of gets summarized as this, green, red, yellow chart. The reason I mentioned the gala is we've heard people like the VP of some company come in and he's just not informed, but he's so well-meaning, and he'll get up there and he'll say, we embrace your sexual preference and blah, 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 and everybody's just cringing because it's not a sexual preference. And that's kind of a term that the religious right uses, is that, we can turn it on or off, and why don't you just be straight and be like everybody else? It's not a preference, it's an identity and it's an orientation. So little words like that, alternative lifestyle was kind of the buzzword back in the 90s, but the point is, alternative to what? I mean, it's just as normal as everything else. So another term is gay marriage. The preferred term is marriage equality, because I got married last year, but I didn't get gay married last year, I just got married. And it's interesting, and some people use the term transgendered like it was an event, last Tuesday. It's a process, it's an identity, it's a culture. And we also really caution against the word gay. A lot of destinations will say we have a gay neighborhood and we have a gay cafe and we have a gay-owned business, and that really just now it starts to really feel exclusive. So we really try and caution against that. So let me get into a little bit about how we do research, and then I'm going to wrap up with some case studies of what's worked out there. So in research, as I mentioned, there's no one definition of LGBTQ. Since the census doesn't ask that question, we don't have any numbers. And even if the census asked that question today, it would still be a problem, because why? 29 states, you can be fired for being gay. So until there's full legal equality in the country, there's going to be a large proportion of LGBT people who don't want to check that box, don't ever want to be identified, because their boss would fire them, or it could have implications of their family, etc. So corporations typically look for the LGBTQ culture. Those of us who are engaged with pride events, with film festivals, reading the gay media, just sort of involved in the LGBTQ community. Academics are looking at the SOGI identity. SOGI is sexual orientation, gender identity. And it's a new term probably for a lot of you, but the census uses that because it's not a culture. LGBTQ is kind of more of a culture. Anybody can be queer, right? Just it's how you identify, or how you want to, what term you want to use. But SOGI is sexual orientation and gender identity. Health organizations don't care what your culture is. They want to know, does this man have sex with another man, and what are the health implications of that? And the census looks at same-sex couples. So they do count that, but that so totally underrepresents, because not all of us are in a relationship when we take our census. So there's all kinds of different approaches, and that yields all kinds of different results. So we don't have our own clear definition. The census isn't much help. And the LGBTQ community is really a combination of sexual orientation, sexual behavior, gender identity, culture, and things that we share that were, in terms of discrimination and social challenges. So a lot of surveys that you probably take will say, what is your gender? Are you male or female? Well, all of a sudden, that knocks out LGBTQ, because even if I identify as a gay male, I'm offended at the fact that you don't have an option for those of us in our community who don't identify in a binary way like that. We've seen some that say, what is your gender? Male, female, transgender, or other. Well, transgender isn't a gender. It's a community, you could say. Transgender isn't a gender. There are trans men, trans women, and trans non-binary. So our approach is this. It's a laundry list, and we ask this and a lot more in our surveys. Every time we do a survey, we have a long list of options. And importantly, we say, mark all that apply. We don't say, are you this or this? And if you mark one and start to mark another, it disappears the other. We allow anybody to identify in any combination of ways that they want. And this makes everybody feel very included. Now, I don't think that, sorry?
Do you see more than 50% of people marking more than one?
Yes. Yeah. The question was, do you think that more than 50% mark more than one? And yes, absolutely. There could be a lesbian woman who's also queer. There could be a trans man who's also straight. Think about that. That's very possible. So there's lots of different iterations. And similar with, well, we never ask sexual preference, but we have seen that in surveys, and that's just right out the gate. It's offensive. What's your sexual orientation? We've seen straight or heterosexual, gay or lesbian or homosexual. Homosexual is a clinical term, but we don't use it culturally. Are you bisexual? That opens a whole lot of things. So again, we sort of ask this long list of identities that allows anybody to mark whatever they want. And the term queer, it's not a sexual orientation, it's not a gender identity, it's a culture. And a lot of people who identify as queer sort of say, enough with all the different letters, we're just different and we're proud of it, and call me queer. And so queer is also a term that we include constantly. So let's flip through a few case studies. I think that it's really interesting to see from the community's perspective what it is that makes someone want to buy something. An advertiser would think that placing an ad in an LGBT magazine is the best thing to do, but the community would disagree with that. They say the first thing that you should do is get involved in our community, support your employees, support our charities, support our political causes, and that's what you will find will motivate me to purchase from you, more than advertising. So we see the sort of the categories of LGBT charities and political causes as the largest motivator across both gay and lesbian, and the advertising options, which are important. I'm not discounting them, but they're less important to us. We really want to see that a company is involved and engaged. So a few ways that companies have done that. Target hired us several years ago when one of their executives made a large contribution to a state initiative in Minnesota that was considered to be anti-LGBT. So our community, you know, we know everything, so we found out about that, and there was a boycott on Target, saying that they're discriminating against the LGBTQ community, and Target came right back and said, we apologize, that was one person's opinion, we can't control everybody, but look at us as a company. You know, we've been giving back, we support our employees and so forth, and they're doing some really, I think, breakthrough stuff right now. One thing is you go into a Target store and you see these end caps, and it sort of directs you to, you know, what you want to buy. And in the olden days, they used to have things like girls' building sets. And then they said, why are we doing that? Stop it. There aren't girls' building sets and boys' building sets, they're just building sets. Take off the gender identity and let anybody choose whatever the hell they want, right? And that was breakthrough. And similarly, they are neutralizing the male changing rooms and the female changing rooms and, bathrooms, et cetera. And they're really working, I think, genuinely to make a difference out there. So that's one. Apple has long included LGBT in all of their imagery and advertising. This is an ad by Apple that was sort of a vignette of different, you've seen this taken on the iPhone 8 or whatever kind of ad campaigns, but they had a lesbian couple and their kids. Starbucks was really supportive of marriage equality in Washington State, and for Pride they fly the rainbow flag above there. Amazon was the first to run a mainstream commercial where this guy on the left referred to his husband at the bar behind him. Breakthrough. No advertiser or marketer had ever done that before. And in our survey, we asked which companies have done the best job of outreaching to our community based on their advertising and best practices. Look at this. And this is a write-in question. I can't overemphasize how impactful this is, because people had to type in the word Target. It wasn't a checklist. It wasn't, choose one of the 5 listed here. They had to think, these companies did a good job and made an impact, and I bought from that company, Target. So Target was there, Apple was there, Starbucks was there, Amazon was there. So these companies, by taking these stands in a very public way, are earning market share from the LGBTQ community. I just find that fascinating. So Greater Fort Lauderdale, I don't know if you've been to Fort Lauderdale, but it's what we call a seasoned LGBT destination, meaning it's been at it since the 90s. A lot of people are saying, yeah, I've been there, done that, Fort Lauderdale. So they're really trying to reinvent themselves and doing a fantastic job of it. Their Visitors Bureau has been engaged and supportive of the LGBTQ community across the board for decades. So they commissioned us to do a transgender traveler study because they're saying LGBT this, LGBT that, but then they thought, wait a minute, what is that T? What does it mean? What issues do they face when they come to Fort Lauderdale? What can we do to support them? And what can we do to make sure our hotels include them when they're traveling? And they were the first destination to include transgender models in their advertising. And they even changed their URL, sunny.org, to TLGB to emphasize the T in transgender. So breakthrough first to do that. They also commissioned us to do a family study because really it's just been about gay men going to Fort Lauderdale for a long time, so they really wanted to diversify and came out with a beautiful ad campaign based on that. And also interesting to them is how can they grow the millennial market. So you see this kind of segmentation happening within LGBT, especially among a destination or a product that's been at it for a long time. Las Vegas, we did a study for them in 2004, and we found that they were one of the top few destinations out there, most popular among the community. And every year we do some kind of study for Las Vegas to keep them relevant. Philadelphia is really interesting because we did a study for them before they did any marketing, and then we advised their ad agency, and then 18 months later we went back and did another study. That's one way you can sort of get a sense of return on investment because you do a baseline study and then you do a follow-up study after a campaign. We found that for every dollar that they invested into the market, they yielded $153 back. So that was huge for them. And it also, dollars matter, and so anybody who had sort of a conservative approach to Philadelphia doing this outreach campaign and trying to bring in the gays, all they had to do was say, look, this is the best investment we've ever made. We did this ad campaign and we're making tons of money on it, and that kind of dissolves the conservative objection. We also did a study that compared LGBTs to their general market and found that LGBTQ visitors spent an average of $878 on a visit compared to $559 of ma and pa from the Midwest. Those who were unaware of the LGBTQ ads spent $743. Those who were aware of the ads spent about 30% more. So it really just demonstrates that if a destination, a product or service gets out there and puts out that welcome, that it really can move market share. Marriott is, you think of a really conservative company. It sort of has Mormon roots, et cetera. They're the first hotel group to use a transgender model in their ad campaign. And then Hilton, this ad is, I think, a little racy for any hotel, even if it was a straight couple. But I think that was a remarkable ad. But what's far more remarkable about that, it was the inside cover of Travel and Leisure, which is a general market travel magazine. It's one of the top 2 travel magazines out there. And I only found that by opening Travel and Leisure and seeing that Hilton ad. So what that tells the community and our supporters is that they're walking the walk, right? They're not just waving the little rainbow flag during Pride and then disappearing and hiding. They're coming out and they're saying LGBTQ is part of our message and part of our market. So what we do when we do our studies is we find that Marriott has risen to be the #1 most favored brand among hotels, and Hilton the #2 most favored brand among hotels, and that's changed. If you look at 2009 and 2010, they were 7 or 9%. So by doing these activities of including transgender models, of putting their gay ad into the general market media, they're really, really moving market share. So how do we stay connected and continue this conversation? We have a lot of research available off our website that we post there for free. It's really our best marketing because it grows the community, it grows corporate interest and advertising agency interest in the LGBT market. So you'll find on our website our community survey. We just finished our 12th annual. Our 22nd annual tourism and hospitality survey. Our breakthrough, I think, African American LGBTQ community survey, which sort of gets into that discussion of that intersectionality between ethnicity and race and LGBT. We have a wedding study on there because that's a hot topic for a lot of companies. We have the transgender study. We do business-to-business studies because, you know, we're not just consumers. We go to work and we have an influence of what we purchase at work. And the first ever China LGBT community survey. We had 7,500 LGBT Chinese take that study, by far the biggest of its kind. So if you want to send me a quick little email, if you want a link, I'll make a PDF of this, and I'll send you a copy of it if you'd like it, and I'll send you links to the different studies and my email address, and we'll just continue the conversation. 45 minutes. We did all right. Yeah. Thanks.